Again, ladies and gentlemen, and again I want to introduce myself. My name is Alan Gephardt, and I work at James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Mentor, Ohio. It's about 25 miles east of Cleveland. And I have been here since last evening, and I would like to thank the staff of the National Recreation Gateway Area Sandy Hook Unit. They're keeping me in the Lightkeepers' quarters, which is really wonderful. It's a wonderful old 1883 building, so it almost parallels with President Garfield's life. And also I wanted to mention that a gentleman who could not be here tonight from your area, Joe Bova of Ocean Township.
Oceanport.
Oceanport. Okay. Well, I'm an outlander. Anyway, these images from Harper's Weekly, published in 1881, showing President Garfield being moved from the White House here to Long Branch. And you can look at these after the talk. All right. So we're going to begin. The title of my program is Civil Service Reform and the Death of President Garfield. Standard history textbooks tell you that Charles Guiteau, the assassin of James Abram Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, was a disappointed office seeker. That's accurate to a point, but there is more to the circumstances of President Garfield's tragic murder than that. Next. The origins of the drama that unfolded in the spring and summer of 1881 can be found more than a decade earlier, and there was quite a cast of characters, including 3 presidents of the United States, a vice president of the United States, a senator from New York, various newspaper editors, a Secretary of State, and of course, a madman. Uniting them all was a then hot political issue that is forgotten today: civil service reform. It was inside the Beltway politics before there was a Beltway. This issue led to President Garfield's assassination, and his assassin, Charles Guiteau, said as much. Beginning in the 1860s, many politicians and newspaper editors felt that the federal civil service needed reform. According to historian Ari Hugenboom, the Civil War accelerated developments like the spreading of railroads, the creation of large national corporations, and a much larger federal civil service. So, large institutions are being created or expanded as a result of the Civil War. There were many civil servants, civilian employees, in the Department of the Interior, the Post Office, the Treasury Department, and other agencies. They owed their positions to the congressmen and senators who recommended their appointments to the President of the United States. In exchange for a federal position, these workers were expected to perform political work while performing their duties. In other words, to perform political work in addition to the duties of their jobs. At election time, federal employees were assessed a portion of their salaries, usually 2 to 5%, to fund campaigns. There was nothing illegal about this, maybe unethical, but nothing illegal. You would go to a federal worker and say, pony it up so we can run a campaign. Democrats, Republicans, everybody did it. Because election officials were often defeated, or elected officials were often defeated for re-election, federal workers could find themselves out of a job after only a few years. This resulted in a lack of continuity in the work of the government, and obviously left federal workers without security. Competent and honest workers could be replaced by incompetent and dishonest persons, and institutional memory suffered. The first legislation to propose reform of the federal civil service appeared in December 1865. That's just a few months after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, when Rhode Island Congressman Thomas Allen Jenks, next, introduced a bill to create a civil service commission to formulate rules for civil servants and establish examinations for certain positions in the federal service. By this time, it was known that frauds, waste, and incompetency in the New York Custom House were costing the American public an estimated $12 to $25 million annually. Jenks's 1865 bill did not pass. Still, reforming the federal civil service remained a goal of many. In 1871, Congress passed legislation permitting President Grant to create the first Federal Civil Service Commission. In June, Grant appointed a commission chaired by the highly respected George William Curtis, editor of Harper's Weekly. Curtis was an advocate of competitive examinations. You don't get your job because of who you know, you get your job because you passed a test that says you're qualified to do the job. That's the idea. Many of Grant's supporters, particularly Senator Conkling of New York, Senator John Logan of Illinois, Senator Don Cameron of Pennsylvania, opposed reform. They built their political machines through the old patronage system. Congressional appropriations for the commission were minimal, only $25,000, and that was largely due to the efforts of Representative James Abram Garfield of Ohio. When Congress later cut the funding, Grant abandoned reform. It was during the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes that civil service reform came into the national spotlight. The issue also expanded the notoriety of the colorful New York Senator Roscoe Conkling. Next. A man who wore canary yellow waistcoats, twisted his thick, wavy blonde hair into a spit curl in the center of his forehead, and used lavender ink on his letters. He was quite something, and a very powerful man in his day. James G. Blaine, his longtime antagonist, faulted him for his, love this quote, his haughty disdain, his grandiloquent swell, his majestic, supereminent, overpowering turkey gobbler strut. Conkling was determined to maintain his influence over political appointments in his state. Civil service reform pitted President Hayes against Senator Conkling. It was this issue that led to the assassination in 1881. Next. President Rutherford B. Hayes was determined to reform the federal civil service. He wrote in his diary on April 22, 1877, shortly after becoming president, "Legislation must be prepared and executive rules and maxims formed. We must limit and narrow the area of patronage. We must diminish the evils of office seeking. We must be relieved of congressional dictation as to appointments." And Conkling could not have disagreed with President Hayes more. The New York Custom House became the target for reform as the Republican Party became increasingly divided. It was, perhaps unjustly, the prime example of corruption and inefficiency, not the Republican Party, the New York Custom House. At the urging of Treasury Secretary John Sherman, Hayes appointed a commission to investigate it. The result was a May 1877 report that condemned waste and the assessments paid by employees and merchants to Custom House officials to fund campaigns. The commission report brought the collector of the Port of New York, Chester Allen Arthur, into national view. Arthur was initially praised for his willingness to institute reform, but then he was dismissed by Hayes, and it's all politics. He was dismissed by Hayes in September of 1878, and Conkling was livid. Now, how did the fight between Hayes and Conkling figure into the tragic events of the summer of 1881? Well, first of all, President Hayes, for all his commitment to the ideals of civil service reform, had political motives for attacking Senator Conkling. Conkling had opposed Hayes's nomination. He had been conspicuously silent during the campaign. He had failed to carry New York for Hayes, and he had refused to assist Hayes in winning the presidency when that disputed election was not resolved until 2 days before the inauguration. And Conkling just sat on his hands, didn't do anything to help Hayes. After Hayes' inauguration, Conkling began referring to President Hayes, they're both Republicans, you know. He begins referring to President Hayes as Rutherford and his fraudulency. Conkling's animosity toward Hayes was later transferred to one of Hayes' lieutenants in the House of Representatives, James A. Garfield. Right. Politically speaking, Hayes was serving Conkling his just deserts next. By attacking Arthur, Hayes was really attacking Conkling. And Hayes was momentarily triumphant. Arthur was gone, but not for good. Love this cartoon. The Hayes-Conkling fight in 1877-78 became the Garfield-Conkling fight 3 years later, next. President Hayes did not seek re-election in 1880. Consequently, the Republican nomination for president was wide open. There were 3 major candidates vying for it at the time. Senator James G. Blaine of Maine, the leader of the half-breed faction, the pro-reform faction of the Republican Party, Treasury Secretary and fellow Ohioan John Sherman, to whom Garfield was pledged, and former President Ulysses S. Grant, the favorite of the stalwart, the anti-reform faction of the party, and the odds-on favorite for the nomination. Conkling supported Grant. Conkling was for Grant because when Grant was president, from 1869 to 1877, he had pretty much allowed Conkling and other Republican senators to take the lead in filling appointive offices in the federal bureaucracy. In other words, a man like Senator Conkling was free and able to build his political machine without the interference or influence of the President of the United States. Next. But there was a hitch, an obstacle, a bump in the road to Grant's nomination, and it was the unit rule. At the start of the Republican convention, the rules required that each state's delegation be pledged to the candidate who had the majority, the backing of the majority of its delegates. That is, the delegation would vote as a unit for one candidate, the leading candidate within that delegation. Had this rule remained in effect, Grant would have been nominated. And of course, then there would have been no Garfield assassination. The Sherman and Blaine delegates knew this, so they set out to repeal the unit rule, allowing delegates to vote for the candidate of their choice. Who was one of the leaders in the repeal effort? Why, none other than Congressman Garfield, who was the chair of the Rules Committee. And there was a second individual who was involved in the overturning of the unit rule within the Republican convention, and his name was William Robertson, and he was a state senator from New York, and he was very much opposed to Grant, and he was even more opposed to Conkling. And his name's going to come back up because he plays a central role in the drama that's going to unfold. Now, with Garfield, in the position of the chairman of the Rules Committee, he had a lot of influence, and he used it. And again, this unit rule was repealed. Discarding the unit rule made it impossible for Grant to win the nomination. Instead, a deadlocked convention nominated Garfield on the 36th ballot, and to this day, the Republican convention of 1880 is the longest convention in the party's history. 36 ballots. Next. Senator Conkling was displeased. So much so that he said during the summer that he expected that Garfield would lose to the Democrat, General Winfield Scott Hancock. There's a fort down the road named for him, isn't there? And that was all right by Conkling. Grant could be nominated in 1884. Conkling sat on his hands again during the summer of 1880, just as he had when Hayes was running in 1876. But Garfield is the nominee. And Conkling tried to win concessions from Garfield over control of New York political appointments. Conkling also wanted a New Yorker to be the Treasury Secretary. That was something that Garfield absolutely refused to do, for the very practical political reason that all the Midwestern states would just howl that a New Yorker was in control of the Treasury, because there was a great deal of controversy over money and its availability throughout the country in this period. So having a New Yorker controlling how much money is in the Midwest and in the West or in the Deep South was not going to go with a lot of Republicans from those sections of the country. So Garfield was opposed to this, but Conkling's surrogates said that Garfield agreed to this. Garfield's men said he didn't. And Garfield's troubles with Conkling during the campaign did not lessen when Garfield was elected by a razor-thin majority on November 2nd, 1880. The divided Republican Party required the president-elect to attempt to satisfy its various factions with cabinet posts and with various other diplomatic and domestic offices. Garfield knew that he had to accommodate Conkling as much as he could. He invited the senator to Mentor, to his home, to talk. As Ken Ackerman notes in Dark Horse, The Surprise Election and Political Murder of President James A. Garfield, Conkling's response to the invitation hinted ominously at his future course, at Conkling's future course, if his demands were not met. This is a direct quote. "I need hardly say that your administration cannot be more successful than I wish it to be." Little double meaning there, isn't it? Yeah. Just what did Conkling mean by that? He could be supportive or he could be very destructive, as he had been with Hayes. The meeting was not a great success, and the tensions between these two men, Conkling and Garfield, continued to grow. Garfield tried to satisfy various political factions through appointments to his cabinet. Potential members accepted, declined, and reneged based on the approval of Senator Conkling. And then there were the competing claims of the incoming Secretary of State, James G. Blaine. He did not want to reward Conkling, so tensions within the Republican Party, again, they're just increasing. The political situation was impossible. And James Garfield was criticized for lacking backbone. In March, President Garfield nominated 5 New York stalwarts for government posts next. He nominated William Robertson, Conkling's adversary, for that most important post of Collector of the Port of New York. The Robertson nomination set up a Senate confirmation fight between Garfield and Conkling that distracted the already distracted Republican Party and the press for more than 2 months. Conkling distrusted Garfield as much as he had Hayes. Garfield returned the compliment. Reflecting in his diary on the political fight between himself and the senator from New York, Garfield wrote in the spring of 1881 that he was bound to determine whether I was the registering clerk of the Senate or the executive of the government. A compromise was sought. A meeting, yet another meeting, was arranged between Senator Conkling and President Garfield. But just before it took place, a telegram came from the governor of New York urging Conkling to drop his opposition to Robertson's nomination to the collectorship. Governor Cornell's telegram got Conkling's backup, and he refused to meet the president. He did not go to the White House. When Garfield heard about this, he refused to rescind Robertson's nomination to the collectorship. Garfield's backbone was indeed stiffened. "Robertson may be carried out of the Senate head first or feet first. I shall never withdraw him." By a wide margin, the nation's newspapers supported Garfield's stance. Garfield confided to his diary, "I owe something to the dignity of my office. Shall the principal port of entry, in which more than 90% of all our customs duties are collected, be under the control of the administration or under the control of a single senator?" That is the politics behind the assassination. Now, consider the assassin, Charles Guiteau, next. Charles Guiteau was born in Illinois in September 1841. His mother died when he was 7, and his father, Luther Guiteau, was often abusive toward him. In young adulthood, Guiteau became involved with the Oneida community of New York, a free-love commune. Charles was not popular with the ladies at Oneida. They called him Charles Get Out. Failing to find himself at Oneida, he pursued a career in the law and then took up theology. He was successful at neither. In 1880, Charles Guiteau wanted to find fame and fortune in politics. He went to New York after Garfield's nomination, ingratiated himself with Republican officials, and gave a pro-Garfield speech at a rally for the Republican ticket in New York. When the Garfield-Arthur ticket won in November, the self-deceiving Guiteau told himself that he was instrumental in Garfield's victory. He reasoned that he deserved a political reward, a job in the government. He believed that he would make an excellent consul to Paris, even though he had no prior diplomatic experience whatsoever. He tried repeatedly to make an appointment with President Garfield to talk about it. He made such a nuisance of himself that the President's secretary, Joseph Stanley Brown, decided that he should be quietly kept away. Next. Guiteau also badgered James G. Blaine, Garfield's political confidant and the Secretary of State. Early in the administration, he regularly visited Blaine in his office. On more than one occasion, he presented Blaine with a copy of Garfield Against Hancock, the speech that he delivered in New York. It would remind Blaine of Guiteau's service in the campaign. Blaine became exasperated with his repeated encounters with this badgering man. He told Guiteau to never again bring up the Paris consulship to him. Meanwhile, the fight between President Garfield and Senator Conkling was coming to a head in the U.S. Senate. The President of the Senate was Garfield's Vice President, Chester Arthur. The role he chose to play in the fight between his mentor, Roscoe Conkling, and President Garfield must be one of the most remarkable stories in the history of our nation. Chester Arthur had been the collector of the Port of New York, recommended to President Grant by Senator Conkling, and again whom President Hayes had fired in 1878. As a pro-Grant, pro-Conkling Republican, he was nominated for vice president in 1880, again to unify the divided party. We've got Garfield representing the half-breed reform wing, and then we've got Arthur representing the stalwart anti-reform wing. This is interesting to me, and I hope to you, though Conkling urged Arthur to drop the idea as if it were a red-hot shoe from the forge, the former collector did not. The vice presidency was, he said, a greater honor than I ever dreamed of attaining. Next. Despite Conkling's initial misgivings, Chester Arthur proved to be a loyal ally of the New York senator as the new Garfield administration got underway. Arthur and Conkling were a team determined to block the nomination of Robertson. On March 22, 1881, while Arthur was presiding over the Senate, he received a list of President Garfield's New York nominations, including Robertson's. He folded the list to highlight Robertson's name and had a clerk walk it over to Conkling, who was sitting at his desk. Looking over the list, Conkling didn't say a word, but his face suddenly froze and turned crimson. On April 2nd, Vice President Arthur gathered together several New York associates to plan the defeat of his own president's most important political decision to date, to kill the Robertson nomination. And he saw no irony in this. He apparently told several people that he would resign the vice presidency if it would help Roscoe Conkling. When a New York Herald reporter interviewed him, Arthur told him that he and his associates, quote, wanted to lay out their case against the president. Garfield has not been square, nor honorable, nor truthful with Conkling, Arthur explained in a calm, unflinching tone. It is a hard thing to say of a president of the United States, especially coming from the vice president. But it is, unfortunately, only the truth. Garfield, spurred by blame, by whom he is too easily led, has broken every pledge made to us. Not only that, but he seems to have wished to do it in the most offensive way by nominating Robertson. Now, can you imagine a modern vice president acting in such a way? Now, Garfield knew what Arthur was doing, and you can imagine that tensions between those two men increased rapidly. When Garfield withdrew all the New York nominations, except Robertson's, to force a vote on Robertson, Roscoe Conkling and the junior senator from New York, Thomas Platt, resigned their seats. They planned to return to Albany and win re-election from the legislature. Again, remember that before 1914, U.S. senators were not elected by we the people. They were elected by state legislatures. So now Conkling and Platt, they're going to go back to Albany, to the state legislature, and they're going to try to convince the legislature to put them back in office. And of course, that's going to make them politically stronger going back to Washington so that they will be able to defeat the president. And Chester Arthur went to New York to lobby in their behalf. Events moved quickly. With Conkling and Platt gone, the Senate ratified Robertson's nomination on May 18th. President Garfield had achieved an important political victory, but it was a victory that would cost him his life. The Robertson nomination had become a national sensation, and Garfield had won wide support for his strong stand. Still, the Republican Party was becoming more divided, and while Garfield received much more support than not, there were some who criticized and blamed him for the wrenching fight over Robertson. The deranged Charles Guiteau, disappointed in his own hopes for the Paris consulate, was among Garfield's detractors and decided to remove the president in order to save the Republican Party and the country. And he claimed that God was telling him to do this. He purchased an English bulldog revolver from a shop in Washington with borrowed money. Next. It had a mother-of-pearl handle. He thought it would look good in a museum someday. He saw himself as a patriot. He believed that the American public would too. Guiteau began stalking President Garfield. One morning in June, Guiteau followed the president to church. You couldn't shoot a man at his devotions. But then he followed Garfield to the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station on June 18th. The president was taking his wife, Lucretia, to Elberon, New Jersey, to recover from an attack of malaria. Mrs. Garfield, it was feared at one point that Mrs. Garfield might die in the White House. So when you think about that, too, the Garfield presidency was 6.5 months long. And both the President and the First Lady were at one point or another near death, and of course the President actually died. Guiteau couldn't shoot Garfield there either. Mrs. Garfield looked so frail, standing by her husband, that Guiteau said later that he didn't have the heart to fire upon him. On a third occasion, Guiteau watched the President and his Secretary of State, James Blaine, walking arm in arm one evening in Washington. He followed the pair for some time, but did not act. Guiteau had one more chance to remove the President before summer's end. He learned in the newspapers that Garfield would be taking a train to New Jersey on Saturday, July 2nd, to meet his wife and continue on for a vacation in New England and New York. The train would depart the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station at 9:30 a.m. This time, Guiteau was prepared to act. Knowing that he would be arrested and taken to the Washington jail just after the shooting, he wrote a letter to the General of the Army, General William Tecumseh Sherman, instructing the general to, quote, order out your troops and take possession of the jail at once, unquote, following his arrest. Next. The President arrived a few minutes past 9 with Secretary Blaine by his side. They were crossing into the main waiting room when Guiteau fired 2 shots. One grazed Garfield's right arm, the other tunneled into his back. Next. The President collapsed. A physician was called to the scene, and not long after Garfield, in shock and bleeding, was returned to the White House. Guiteau was immediately apprehended. Addressing one of the arresting officers, he said, "I did it. I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." He was hustled off to the Washington jail, where he remained during the 80 days of James Garfield's slow and painful decline. He was put on trial between November 1881 and January 1882. A death sentence was pronounced and carried out 5 months later on June 30th, 1882. He was hanged almost a year to the day from the time that he had shot President Garfield. Guiteau became something of a celebrity in the press. His photograph was taken many times, and interviews and articles by and about him were printed in newspapers all over the country. He always insisted that he was the agent of the deity, and that what he had done was for the good of the country. Incredibly, a Christmas address to the nation by Charles Guiteau appeared in the New York Times on December 27, 1881, in which he reiterated the point. "I suffer in bonds as a patriot, but I am in honorable company. Washington was a patriot. Grant was a patriot. I suffer in bonds because I had the inspiration and nerve to unite a great political party. The deity allowed the doctors to finish my work. I am satisfied with the deity's conduct of this case thus far." He also wrote in an edition of his book, The Truth and the Removal, "I say Garfield deserved to be shot. I say any president that will go back on the men who made him and wreck the organization that elected him and imperil the republic, as Garfield did, deserves to be shot. And I was God's man to do it. Garfield gushers to the contrary." The assassination of President Garfield galvanized the efforts of the National Civil Service Reform League to press for new reform legislation. Soon, that league was distributing literature nationwide connecting the recent murderous attack on the President to the cause of reform. The League promoted public protests and letter-writing campaigns to promote reform legislation. The League also produced pamphlets that referred to Guiteau as a disappointed office seeker. The League achieved its goal when the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was signed into law by President Chester Arthur on January 16, 1883. But the League's characterization of the assassin was inaccurate. Charles Guiteau was a madman who used a political controversy to commit the murder of an elected official. That's what an assassination is. Next. But what he did robbed the country of the leadership of an experienced, intelligent, thoughtful, and talented man. A man of promise. James Abram Garfield, the 20th President of the United States. How did I do it? Hang on. Not 1 minute. Good, thank you. I'm always willing to take any questions that you may have about what I've just spoken about, or anything else that might relate to President Garfield. Yes, sir.
How do you think the civil service reform movement would have fared if Hayes hadn't stolen the 1876 election from Tilden?
Well, that begs the question, did Hayes steal the
Well,
election?
let's presume, just like if we want to have a little controversy, Bush stole the election.
We're not going there, that's for sure.
All right, so then let's stick with Hayes
reasons.
and Tilden. They're all dead.
Yeah, yeah. And we're federal, so we can't talk about recent politics. We can talk about historical politics. So I'm sorry, rephrase the question.
How do you imagine the civil service reform movement would have fared if Tilden
had won?
Well,
you know, Tilden and the Democrats were certainly speaking about reform also. So this is one of the interesting things about that election, right? I think that both men would have supported reform of the civil service. I mean, after all, Tilden went after Boss Tweed in New York, and you know, Tweed was notoriously corrupt. I think, just as a side issue here, I think that Tilden's election to the presidency would not have changed one bit the ending of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was practically over as it was. It would have ended under Tilden or under Hayes. So I think, but again, I think that under Tilden, yeah, there would have been further movement toward reform by him. Whether he would have been able to coalesce members of his own party in support of that, I'm not sure. I don't know that part of the story well enough, but there certainly were a number of Democrats who were supporting civil service reform, and Pendleton, who is George Pendleton of Ohio, was a Democrat. So that reform legislation comes from a Democrat. So I think that it would have happened one way or the other. But I think it's also interesting that the final push for civil service reform comes after President Garfield was killed, much as civil rights legislation was passed in the wake of President Kennedy's assassination in 1964 and 65. So, did I answer your question?
To the extent that a speculative question could be answered. Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How much longer did it take before they did get reform for the civil service? When did they start testing people?
It began again in 1883. It was limited to a rather small classification of federal employees, and succeeding presidents broadened the reach of testing and various rules to encompass a larger and larger faction portion of the federal civil service. But it began in 1883. Yes, ma'am.
Did Conklin come back to Congress?
No. His political career was ended. I will try to remember this quote exactly, but he said something to the effect of, how can I triumph over the grave? How can I fight a shroud? So, no, his political career was ended, and he went on to become, well, he was already a prominent lawyer, and he picked up his law practice again, and he was rather successful at it, made a lot of money, and he died in the blizzard of 1888 in New York. He walked through the storm for 2 hours and collapsed in his home. An abscess developed in his ear. To make a long story short, that was early March of 1888, and an abscess developed in his ear, which killed him in April, and not before the doctors drilled a hole in his head to try to relieve the pressure. I mean, you read about what was going on with Garfield, and then you read what they did to Conklin. Whew, it's pretty awful. Other questions? I didn't mean to skip this interview.
How extensive are the diaries of Garfield?
Well, now I've only seen the published diaries, which I think are pretty complete. They are edited, in other words, they're annotated, so there's a lot of information about people that he mentions or events that he mentions. He began his diary at the age of 16, and it ends a day or two before the assassination. The published diaries that we have 3 sets at the site, and we're always consulting, various members of the staff, we're always consulting. So, volume 4 might be out with 3 other people or whatever. There are some gaps. Like there are a couple of years that there are no diaries apparently. At least they were never published. There are other years which are pretty scanty. But the last several years of his life, they're very full. And he's talking about all kinds of things. Family matters, of course, his literary interests, politics, trips that he's taking that are political. So they're pretty extensive. I think you get a fairly good idea of what he was doing and what was interesting to him, and I think they ought to be pretty extensive. There was a question here, there was something over here, and I know you've got another question, sir. Lady.
How much did he write about Oberon in his diary?
I'd have to go back. There are some mentions in it because, well, first of all, as you all know, it was a resort, and he was here, Grant was here, others. He does talk about it, in particular when he took Mrs. Garfield, when he brought her here in June. He stayed here for a few days with her and with other members of the family. And President Grant was just a couple of cottages away. Right? And I forget what the name of the hotel was. There was a hotel here.
Oberon Hotel.
Hmm?
The Oberon Hotel.
Was it the Oberon Hotel? Okay. So Garfield and Grant are in the hotel, and this is after a couple of days, and Grant finally comes over to Garfield and greets him. And Garfield writes about this, and he says, this is really terrible that he doesn't say that man, but he says that President Grant doesn't have enough respect for the office that he once held to have greeted me upon my arrival here. It took him several days to do it. So there was some bad blood between those two as well. But to that extent, I remember that he writes about the area. But again, he's writing about it in terms of really a political controversy. I don't recall that he mentions anything particularly about the town, but maybe, who knows.
Now, didn't he lead the cause when he was in Congress against when Grant was getting into all kinds of trouble about, Grafton all in his administration?
Well, he was concerned about that. I don't remember that he led anything in terms of revolt.
I thought he was involved in investigations into.
No, he was investigated. Garfield. Yeah, Garfield was involved in 2 relatively minor scandals, Crédit Immobilier and the Gaulier pavement, in which he was accused of taking some money for influence. Relatively small amount of money, and there was no real solid evidence, and several other congressmen were involved, particularly in Crédit Immobilier, and it's still murky, But in terms of Grant and Garfield, one of Garfield's very good friends was a man named Jacob Dolson Cox. They served in Congress together, and Jacob Dolson Cox was appointed by Grant to be the Interior Secretary. And then very early in the administration, because I think, again, Cox was trying to institute some reforms, particularly with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Grant was pressured to fire Cox. And Garfield did not like that and held that against Grant because he thought that, well, again, he and Cox were good friends, first of all, and he also thought that Cox was a very good man and very capable and should not have been fired for doing the right thing. So there was that. Grant was involved Grant wanted to annex what we think of today as the Dominican Republic. And that was very controversial too, and Garfield thought that he was just, why are you wasting your time doing something that you know you can't get done? Because there's not the political support in the Congress to do this. Why are you continuing to pursue this? So I think he looked at Grant as, in many respects, a very fine military leader, but not a very competent political leader. So there are a number of problems between Garfield and Grant. There was a question back here, that gentleman. I haven't forgotten you.
What was the impact of the assassination on improving security for the president?
I don't think there was any. The Secret Service was established in the Civil War period to trace counterfeit money. That was its original purpose. There were Pinkerton guards who were assigned to presidents from time to time, but not consistently. And presidents throughout this period did not want this kind of protection. They did not want to be so surrounded by people, and they wanted to be able to walk the streets freely and so forth. And I think that there was a sort of a fatalistic idea going that, well, look, if somebody wants to get me, they're going to get me, bodyguards or no. So I have not seen anything that indicates that there was markedly any increased protection of presidents after Garfield's assassination. It took a third presidential assassination, that of William McKinley in 1901, for Congress to pass legislation in 1903 or 4 assigning the civil service the duty of protecting the president. And at that time, it was just the president. It wasn't the First Lady and it wasn't their children. I think it's interesting that Molly Garfield, while she was in Washington, while her father was president, she would walk down Washington streets to go to school. Completely you just walk down the street. No one around her to protect her. So, no increased protection that I'm aware of. I'm going to go to this gentleman, and then there was somebody over here, I think, and maybe somebody over here. Sure. Yes, sir.
Garfield's medical care after the wound ranged anywhere from incompetent to negligent. I think it's widely conceded today that his doctors killed him, albeit not intentionally.
Right.
However, was the standard of care for gunshot wounds in that day that bad, or did Garfield just happen to have a particularly poor group of doctors?
I think that it had to do with, more than anything, I think it had to do with who Garfield was at that point. He was the President of the United States.
They tried too hard.
They tried too hard. Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. Dr. Bliss, Dr. Willard Bliss, that's his given name. His parents named him Doctor. So he's Dr. Willard Bliss. But he went by Willard. He was a well-known surgeon in the Civil War period. He performed many surgeries on bullet wounds. He knew that there were a lot of men walking around in 1881 who had bullets in them from the Civil War, and they were fine. But I think it was the fact that this man that he was treating now was the President of the United States, and he tried too hard. The other thing is, I think there was certainly an amount of hubris where Bliss and the other doctors were concerned. They thought they were the authorities. The antiseptic treatment that Joseph Lister had been advocating for 20 years up to that time, not widely accepted in the United States, and Bliss and his fellow physicians on this case, oh, what can germs do? They can't do anything to you. So there was a certain amount of hubris and unwillingness to look at different methods, better methods. Have any of you followed on the internet the National Museum of Medicine ran the daily bulletins that were issued from July 2nd until September 19th. And you read these bulletins, and they're pretty brief, and they'll talk about, well, you know, he ate his food with relish. He had a restful sleep. He didn't sleep so well last night. He didn't eat as much. We are giving him nutritional enemata, nutritional enemas. Things like that, and then we'll talk about his blood pressure, his pulse, and his heart rate. And you read these, and week after week after week after week. And clearly Garfield is not getting better. For a long time he's not getting necessarily worse, but he's not getting better. And you would think at some point one of these fellows would say, maybe we ought to try something different here. You know, maybe we ought to just try Lister's method. They would swab the outside of the wound, but then they would stick their dirty fingers and their dirty instruments into it, so they just, you know. And if they dropped an instrument, they just pick it up and stick it in again. To us, it's incomprehensible that this happened. And it was completely unnecessary because Garfield's wound was not fatal. It didn't strike any major organ, or artery. It didn't penetrate to his spinal column, or spinal cord. He should have been up and around. And he probably would have been fine. And when they did the autopsy, of course, they found what it was, and the body had created a protective cyst around it, rendering it harmless. So it was this massive infection from which he most likely died. When I give tours and people ask this question, I like to make the comparison between 1881 and a 49-year-old James Garfield, and 1981 and a 69-year-old Ronald Reagan. James Garfield was shot in the back. The wound should not have been fatal. The bullet that pierced Reagan's body was within an inch of his heart. And he was much older. And he survived because of medical technology, medical understanding. You know? It's just so sad and ironic and all the rest. There was a question back here, I think. Yes, sir?
I actually have two questions about Chester Arthur.
Okay, Chester Arthur.
Yeah, the first one, he was nominated for vice president in 1880. Surely people knew that he had the opposite opinion about reform from Garfield. In those days, the presidential nominee didn't have say over who would be the vice president.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. And certainly Garfield himself did not select Arthur. Ohio Republicans, however, were behind the Arthur nomination, and what they were trying to do was pull Conkling and other stalwarts on board. Conkling and Logan and Cameron were so upset that Grant did not get that nomination that the Ohio Republicans thought, well, we'll throw a sop to him, we'll nominate Arthur. Now, your point about him being anti-reform, actually, when he was the collector of the port of New York, he did institute many of the reforms. And the other thing about Chester Arthur is that he was not personally corrupt. And this is pretty much borne out in history. Now, say lots of goods come into the port of New York and they don't get claimed. The practice at that time was then for the collector, the naval officer, and, oh, I've forgotten the other fellow, there was a third official. It'll come back to me in a minute. But these three men would sell off the goods and divide the proceeds among themselves, and it was perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. So it was one of the ways that Chester Arthur made a lot of money. And by the way, the collector of the port of New York made more money than the President of the United States, no matter who he was.
Wasn't Arthur's nomination to get him out of the collectorship of New York and sort of shove him aside?
He was already gone. He was already out. No.
Wasn't the vice presidency intended to just...
Oh, no, you're thinking of Theodore Roosevelt. He was the governor of New York 20 years later, and so Tom Platt, who was now the senior senator in New York, he engineered getting Theodore Roosevelt nominated for vice president to get him out of New York. Yeah, that's what it was. You had a second question about Arthur.
The second question was, well, I thought that Arthur was rather anti-reform. I was going to ask you why he signed the reform bill.
Well, it's clear why he signed the reform bill. Because he came into office on the heels of the assassination of Garfield, which had been all about political reform. Civil service reform is part of that issue. The other issue here that I don't talk about is that the presidency itself had weakened since Lincoln. Andrew Johnson really botched it. Ulysses S. Grant had 2 terms in the office in which he seemed to be somewhat incompetent in many respects, not in all, but in many respects, and there was a lot of corruption coming out of his time in office, not necessarily all coming from his administration, though some did. And again, Grant himself was not corrupt, but he's weak. And then Hayes, for all that he tried to do reform, was somewhat ineffective. So the office of president was weakened. Now Hayes standing up to Conkling, that helped strengthen the office a bit. And then Garfield does the same thing, stands up against this powerful senator who's really trying to keep things in the past. And so that's another part of what's playing out here. It is a gradual building up again of the presidency from its nadir under Johnson and Grant. And civil service reform plays into that. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
But didn't he feel as though, didn't he feel a certain amount of guilt?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, coming back to that, yeah. I mean, okay. Chester Arthur was asked by the cabinet at one point to take over, and he absolutely refused. And he refused for very practical reasons. He knew that his reputation in the country was that of a spoilsman. There again, he's going up against Garfield over this nomination. People thought that was terrible. So he doesn't want to step in. It looks like he's, it looks like a coup. So he doesn't want to do that. So he signs it for, I think, a very practical reason. And I think he supported it. One of the interesting things about Chester Arthur to me is that he really turned a page when he became president. He's no longer Senator Conkling's hack. He's the President of the United States. And I think that he really tried to conduct himself in an honorable manner. And he knew that this issue had to be resolved. And he signed the legislation. I think he probably did support it, but I think there's practical politics involved as well. Yes, sir.
I was actually offered the job of American consul in Paris twice.
Really?
Which is why I haven't assassinated anybody yet.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that.
There were rumors after the assassination that Arthur, who, by the way, lived at the corner of Park and Elbron Avenue,
Okay.
at the time of President Garfield's death, that he and or Conkling were somehow involved with Gephardt. Is there any proof of that, or is that just the usual
No,
conspiracy?
the usual conspiracy stuff. There's no proof of that. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Tell us a little bit about your historic site in Memphis.
Sure. Did you hear the question?
No.
Okay. Tell you about James A. Garfield National Historic Site. So, and forgot to bring brochures. So what I'm going to do is I'll send some. I'll send some to you, and you can distribute them at your next meeting.
Okay.
So if you ever come out to Menor, come see us. Oh, how many of you have seen the site? One? Okay. So James A. Garfield National Historic Site is the home and 8 acres of the 158-acre farm that he once had there. He bought the property in 1876, and so he lived there the last 4.5 years of his life. Mrs. Garfield lived there for 42 years. She first of all, he doubled the size of the house in 1880 from a 9-room, 1.5-story structure to a 2.5, 20-room structure. Mrs. Garfield, after his death and funerals, began planning for a memorial at the home, saying that this was the most appropriate place for a memorial to her husband. And so she doubled the size of the house, creating what we call the first presidential library in the United States. And in this sense, it is. She had all of his public and private papers preserved in this library. She wanted eventually to have an official biography written. So all of this material would be there. His diaries, his letters to family and friends, his letters to political associates, constituents, speeches. He wrote articles for the Atlantic Monthly and the North American Review. He wrote encyclopedia articles. He was fluent. He studied 6 languages. I know he was fluent in at least 4 of them. So he was a really bright guy. And she wanted to preserve his memory and preserve this material for that biography and certainly preserve his memory for his children and his grandchildren, and then for posterity as well. So she doubled the size of the house. And so when you come to the site, you see this library, which is, I mean, it's wonderful. It has this beautiful white oak woodwork. It has a coffered wooden ceiling with all this beautiful carving in one area of it. There's just lovely, just lovely. Over 1,000 books in the library alone, and they are original. And again, they're written in 6 languages: English, French, German, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And he studied all of those languages. And she studied 4 of them. And I don't think he ever mastered Hebrew, but I think he actually mastered the others, at least to some degree. And to some good degree as well. So, I mean, really interesting man. And she was an interesting woman. So that's what you see. We have a barn, we have the granary, we have the campaign office from which he operated. There's a windmill there that Mrs. Garfield built. You drive in and there's the windmill. And it had a 600-gallon water tank in it. At the base, of course, there was a wellhead, and there was a mechanical pump, and it pumped water up into the tank, 600 gallons, that then fed a 300-gallon tank in the house, which is still in place. So when she did a lot of work on the house, she had indoor plumbing placed in all 3 floors. Mrs. Garfield was the beneficiary of a subscription fund that was raised by Cyrus Field, the founder of what is now AT&T. And he raised over $360,000 for the Garfield family in the wake of the president's assassination. In today's money, that would be over $8 million. And this was given by the American public to the Garfield family. Rich people, poor people, black, white, young, old, people in the North and South contributed to this fund. And she did a lot with the money, and she transformed a working farm into a country estate. And it continued to be a working farm right into the 20th century. But these are the things that you would see. Over 85%, no, excuse me, over 80%, about 85% original furnishings in the house, which is also really neat. There aren't many 19th century presidential homes that have as much original furnishings as we do. There are a couple that have more, but most of them don't. Yes, sir?
Are there any Garfield heirs around?
Yes, there are. Yeah, there are over 400 living descendants of President and Mrs. Garfield. There are people who still live in the Cleveland area, Garfields who still live in the Cleveland area. Saw about a dozen of them last week, as a matter of fact. We had an event. And about a dozen of them, young, little ones, and one who's in his late 80s, great-grandson, Bobby Garfield. Neat guy. Anyway, yep, they're still in the area, and then they're all over the country as well. 400 plus. Any other questions?
What did she die of?
She died of respiratory failure. From what I have read, I can't determine exactly if they knew exactly what it was. I don't see the word pneumonia stated, or emphysema, or anything like that. So I don't know, but it was something respiratory. She died on March 14th, 1918. She was a month shy of 86 when she died. She was a widow for 36 and a half years. Yeah. She died in South Pasadena, California. Her son-in-law and daughter, Molly and Joe Stanley Brown, bought property in Pasadena. She bought some property in South Pasadena, had a house built there, and it's still standing. And we understand at the site that it's privately owned by the sister and brother-in-law of Madonna. Yeah. Any other questions, ladies? Yes? Oh.
Just tell us a little bit about yourself, like, where you're from,
Okay.
how long you've been at the site.
Yeah. I am, I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland, and still legally from there. But I've fallen in love with Northeast Ohio, and so now I'm trying to get myself relocated. And that's going to be tricky for me because I am a seasonal park ranger. And I joined the service 7 years ago at the urging of a friend of mine in the museum world in Baltimore, who is the chief of interpretation at Fort McHenry. And right now, it's really difficult to get a full-time position with the Park Service, especially in a historic site. So I'm trying to figure out, what am I going to do? And now, and I love my job at Garfield. I absolutely love it. I have fallen in love with the story, with these people. They're wonderful. These were wonderful people. I almost didn't come back this year because of the sequester, and the sequester's still in effect next year, and so we'll see. You know? In the meantime, I'm going to try to just position myself to be in that area, and if all I can ever be at some point is a volunteer there, then I'll be a volunteer there. But it is a wonderful site, it's a wonderful story. James Garfield was an incredible human being, and his wife was a really neat lady, too. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in history. I was educated both at two Maryland schools. What else? Museum. I've been doing museum work for about 25 years. And before that, I worked with seniors in senior centers and nursing homes and stuff like that. So that's my background. Thank you all. Thank you. Tom Hoffman is going to talk to you now about, he told me, but I've forgotten, something that's happening in your community that you need to know about.